Hey gang, we're back and ready for sprint 2 of the OMB eRegs engagement. We're going to dive right in. We are in sprint Barbina, following our ABC ordering. And we're wrapping up 2 weeks of work here. This is our bi-weekly sprint demo if this is the first time you ever joined. Here at 18F, we work in the open. Almost everything we do is open source and shared. And to follow that, we are recording these demos and sharing them out so that folks can see what we worked on, track how we're progressing, provide feedback and such. At the end of the sprint, or after the end of the demo, we will have a call-in number that you can hop on and share your thoughts, ask questions and such. But to make this the most easy to broadcast across many different channels and video requirements of agencies, we're using YouTube live stream Hangouts for this. So this is being recorded. You can refer to it in the future. Watch it, share it with your colleagues, watch it at home with your mom, eat some popcorn, binge watch all of the demos and chill. Anyways, I'm getting derailed here, and we're going to dive into our sprint demo.
Awesome. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. So we'll be talking about. Sorry. Go on, Will.
And I will hand it off to CM now.
Perfect.
Who is champing at the bit to join in, and now I will make him the presenter.
Excellent.
And here we go.
Okay. So I will be showing stuff in just a moment, but to give us some context, we'll recall that we have these policy documents, which are PDFs split into paragraphs and headers and bullets and things of that nature. OMB has been kind enough to go through those policy documents and pull out specific chunks of text, which are the actual requirements. That's what the agency must do. The rest of the text is contextual. It explains the history, the authority, things of that nature. But to get the gist, you just have the requirements. Further, OMB has gone through those specific requirements and pulled out parts of speech almost. So the subject, the entity that must perform this action, the verb, the dates that they must do it. John mentioned earlier this concept of, and by earlier I mean previously, this concept of a to-do list. Can we present those requirements as something that agencies can go through and say, I did this, I did that, etc. We can't do that with the requirement text directly because the requirement text is too long. It's not a very good to-do list if each one of them has multiple paragraphs. But we can take those componentized subject, verb, etc., and try to create a simpler to-do list. And as soon as I can share, I will. Here we go. Okay. So we took those same columns that were in that CSV. So the CSV included a column for due dates. It included a column for the subject, i.e. who it applies to, as well as a sort of priority. How important was it that this action be performed? So we can take those component fields out and recreate the requirements in a much more concise format. So here we've got in green, the due date, in purple, the subject, i.e. who has to perform the action, the priority, that is the must, should, can, and then kind of a text blob at the end, which is the actual thing that must happen. And to make this more to-do list-like, we can start adding concept of citations or definitions, something that can be expanded if you want more information, but we have this more concise form for a to-do list sort of format. Now each of these, so there's roughly 20 here, and they were pulled out manually. So I went through 2 documents, 2 policies, and pulled out roughly 20 requirements and hand-coded them using that CSV as a good guide. But they are all tied to that original text. So the original text is here on hover. You can see that in some cases, the original text is significantly longer than this shorter, more concise form. And that's kind of what we're going for, is making it easier to read by making easier sentences. A problem here, though, is that the most interesting component of requirements is the action that must be performed. And that's the part that we're treating kind of like a plain text field. Can we split that up further to be more useful? So what we'd like to do is to create very simple sentences, kind of like the boy hit the ball over the fence. Now, if you think about how that's structured grammarly in terms of grammar, you've got the subject, the boy, the verb, hit, the direct object, the ball, and over the fence is a modifier on that verb. So it's kind of the how of that verb. So I went through and took those same 20 requirements and tried to break them out in terms of those components. We've got a subject in blue, we've got the priority still in red, the verb in purple, the direct object in green, and the how, the modifier, in brownish dark red. And then we still got the due date in orangish yellow. So this is even easier to read. And we could hypothetically filter based on any of these components instead of just the agency and the due date. And again, because we have, this is all tied to the original requirements, we can hover and see the original requirement text, which I've also gone through and marked up using the same colors, using the same components. So you can see that this says a new SAO is the direct object in green. And you see that it's also here in green. So this is going at it from a requirements to document perspective. We could invert that and start with the document. So here are those two documents. I separated them by a horizontal rule. Here's the two documents. They've been marked up using the same colors that we had before in the previous slide. If I hover, I can say, all right, this component of the text, the policy text, refers to a specific requirement. Therefore, I can defocus everything else, and in the upper left-hand corner, display that simpler, more concise to-do list-like version of the requirement. And in some cases, in many cases, the same text will be used for multiple requirements. So here, Administrator of General Services is being used for 1, 2, 3, at least 3 requirements. And when I hover on any of the requirements, I see just that requirement. When I hover on the shared bit, I see all 3 requirements. So that's the prototyping component. We've also been working on building a practical system. So Teresa's been working on building a front-end framework that allows us to start building quickly. That's not always easy in the front-end world. And Tig and I have been working on the Django side. So here we were given that list of that CSV list of requirements, and we've actually imported each of those into a database that we can access through. This is the Django administration screen. So here we've got all of the requirements, all 1,400 of them. We can click through. We've tried to normalize the data as much as possible. So all multiple requirements will share a policy. That's why it's here. We can dive into a single policy and look to see that the data has been normalized. So for example, dates are a date field. Policy type is a selector, etc. Also within those requirements, we've gone through and turned the keywords into a tag list so we can do our auto completion. And we can add additional phrases. And so that's what we've been working on from the tech side. I believe Jen has joined, and so I'm going to kick it back to her.
Hey everyone, let me share my screen. So yes, I and John have been working on the user research aspect of this project. And over the past sprint, we've done our first kind of initial sprint, I guess, into user research. So the first thing we did, let me just talk about who we talked to so that we then understand sort of what our findings are so far. So we talked to 9 people total, all of which were federal employees, 3 of them inside OMB, specifically desk officers, and 6 outside of OMB, part of the agencies who are actually using this policy on a day-to-day basis. And we have a handful, we have 3 specifically scheduled for next week, and hopefully we'll have a few more. We definitely need to talk to a few more people within OMB, specifically in the policy department, maybe the cyber department, and also hopefully we'll get a CIO in there as well as a few other agency users. So that's what we've been working on. And before I kind of push the slide forward, the method we've been using this sprint is called user interviews, pretty self-explanatory. Basically, with all these 9 people, we sat down or over the phone, just had a conversation about their roles, how they interact with this policy on a day-to-day basis. And the goal was to, after you talk to this many people, you start to find patterns of where the pain points are in people's day-to-day works and what workarounds people are starting to build around this kind of, this is a very, I'm trying to be general, so any problem that we're trying to solve. So the goal here is to kind of organize the problem space so that we can then build solutions based on those problems that really fit the user's needs in these situations. So that was the goal here. And I have basically a rough cut and early findings of our user research. So there's going to be a bunch of quotes following this. So I'm going to try and string them into one narrative, but I apologize if it's a bit choppy because, again, this is just initial reactions. There will hopefully be more even next sprint. But so to start us off, this was actually said by a desk officer, but I think that this is so far the best quote that kind of explains the problem. The hardest part is pulling the needle out of the haystack. Requirements are hard to find. The documents are long. They're not necessarily published in a consistent either format in terms of the way they're written, or where they're published necessarily. They're hard to find, and the big question is, what do I have to comply with? What policies apply to me? And I think that this quote here kind of applies to that as well. We heard a lot about that. It's hard to figure it out. From the desk officer perspective, we tried to get what was the most common question. Are there frequently asked questions that come? And generally, we heard that each agency has its own personality, has its own problems. So they're going to come to the agency with different questions. But the closest thing you get to the most commonly asked question is, what was the process of coming to the conclusion? Like, why this policy? What's the background? What's the history? Why does it exist? And we heard that OMB desk officers often, not always, it depends on the policy, obviously, don't always have a good answer to that question, simply because of turnover in the agency. If a policy was written, 3-4 years ago, there might not have the background for why it exists, might not be written either in an easy to find place or at all. So sometimes it's hard to figure out that why, and we heard that is hard from an implementation standpoint, especially, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then from the agency side, we heard a lot about the way that policies are written, right? It's very broad. I'm the person in the day-to-day work, and it doesn't quite directly apply to me. And a lot of the conversation had to do with translating OMB policy into agency policy, and kind of the interpretation and maybe misinterpretation that happens along those lines. And English is hard. And then digging deeper into English is hard. Nouns, verbs, everything gets translated differently between agencies, between offices within agencies. Specifically, one big problem was between OMB and when the Inspector General comes. We heard that even though OMB wrote down what they intended, Inspector General may interpret it differently. So that's a specific problem and a little bit off track, but that's an example of the interpretation issues we're seeing. And here, one of our users said that he actually made an entire document where he had to figure out what the word information system meant, and it took him 3 statutes, 2 documents, 1 appendix to really define the word information system. So there's this concept here that definitions apply across different documents, and one document might not be siloed or might not have the information that you need to really finish your interpretation. And then we know that there is a hierarchy of documents within these OMB guidance, and I know the desk office especially understood this, but from the implementation perspective, nobody seemed to pay attention to the different document types. This person even said, I don't understand why OMB chooses one document over the other. No matter what comes down, the same level of work goes into it, or the same importance is given to it. And the topics are what's the most important for people, not necessarily the document type. It's more the area of focus that they focus on within there. And then finally, we also tried to take a look at the documents themselves, and we tried to glean some useful and maybe not useful and things like that to help us moving forward. So this page is showing some useful things that exist. I know we heard a lot about the HTTPS memoranda, or I'm not, don't quote me on whichever document it fits, I apologize. But that is a frequently asked questions, and we heard that that was really easy to follow, and that there's a few others that have them, and that they're very encouraging. The list on the left here, not all policies have these necessarily, but these are things that would maybe be helpful if they were able to be implemented into policies or used in a tool that we end up building. What's not useful is the heavy government language that a lot of anything in government is written in. And the fact that the documents are different, they're so different, you can't really read one and expect the next one to read the same way. And that tends to make things harder to understand, and it feels like maybe there's an intention to make it harder to understand whether or not there is. And then finally, this is what I talked about a little bit earlier. What might be missing in some, I know, this is very much a generalization, but that understanding of why this policy is important, why is OMB asking me to do this? It may even go a step beyond background. This is something we definitely need to look more into, but this is something that we heard multiple times over those group of 6 users this week. That is something that is missing that would help them in their implementation process. And now I'm going to pass it along to John to talk about the method we use to kind of keep going on this process.
Yeah, hi everyone. I think, Will, do you guys switch the presenter to me? There we go. Cool. Yeah, so like Jen was saying, we spent a lot of time out doing research, and this is just to give a little insight into how we sort through all of this kind of stuff. We did a team exercise yesterday where Jen and I took some time translating a lot of these notes that we were taking during the interviews into digestible pieces of feedback, and then did some sorting there. And kind of what that turns into was a team sketching exercise where we sketched some things to gain a little bit more clarity. And I'm going to go into this now to talk first a little bit about what a sketching session is, and kind of, or at least what it is in this context, and why we chose to do it. So ultimately, we're very early in the process here. We are still kind of figuring out, there's so many different possibilities of how we can take on all of these documents and policies and make them more readable. So we want to use this session to surface the user needs that could be addressed. So we spent a lot of time talking to people everyone interprets that in their own way. We want to make sure we're, as a team, sort of thinking the same priority of what's important, and make sure the team understands the challenge pretty well. And then really to start planting the seeds for potential solutions. So we didn't necessarily plan to come out of this meeting with 100% surefire direction of like, this is the exact feature we're going to build. It's going to look exactly like this. This is really set up in a way to allow people to kind of get their ideas out there and talk about the different directions that they might want to go with different things. So the way we started this out is the session had 2 phases. And to start things off, I took a prompt that I created, and this was kind of the prompt that we were all sketching towards. So the idea was, policy is very complicated, and one topic may span many policies or vice versa. How can we make it easier for people to see which policies apply to them? And kind of with that in mind, we went into sketching some ideas that might solve that problem. And ultimately, our sketches covered a lot of different, I guess I want to say, features that could be potentially built out to address some of these things. So I'm going to go into a couple of them now without getting too specific into the actual implementations, because ultimately I think we're just kind of at the stage where we want to get some ideas out there and see what is technically possible and be able to have further discussions about these. So one thing that came out of ideas that came out of the user interviews is this idea of tagging topics and sortability. And I think you've probably seen a lot of these in CM's demos, but we felt that the general concept of being able to find the things that are important to the agency you work in, the field that you work in, things like that were very important for people to be able to navigate these policies more effectively. So here are some ideas people had about how that might look. Maybe there's a search with some drop downs where you're picking certain things. Maybe it's kind of like a filter environment. A lot of possibilities here. Another thing that we thought could address a lot of user needs that were coming up in the discussions were defined terms. So there's a lot of confusing language, and we want to help people out with that as much as they can. So there are different ways that maybe you provide certain highlighted terms, and then that can provide a better definition of what those terms might look like. Maybe there's a glossary of some sort. A lot of possibilities there. This sort of the one thing that's going to be on our minds a lot is the concept of how much do we want to show the full document, whether it be a memo or circular or whatever, versus a more truncated version of a specific requirement, and how do these things kind of coexist. So this is really applicable to the demo that CM did earlier, but we had a few different ideas of ways that you might show like a very easy to digest requirement, and then how that translates into or how it ties back to the larger memo with more additional information that might be relevant. And lastly was the potential of some checklist type interfaces. So as you're going through all these different policies that apply to you, there are going to be things that you need to do out of those policies. And we want to assist people as much as we can to help them keep track of the things that they have done, the things that they haven't, and kind of, if there's any sort of subcategories that they need to be addressing, we want to give them the opportunity to see all those. And with that, I will pass back to Will.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We're going to jump on a conference call in a second here. I'm going to show. Okay, awesome. Our next demo will be in 2 weeks on Friday, February 17th. Same bet time, different bet channel. But if you're on the invite or know friends, they can hook you up. We'll post in the Slack channel. Matt will share it out. If you have feedback about this process too, please let us know. If it's not working for you, let us know. You can contact us, follow along on the GitHub, and here's the dial-in info. So go ahead and dial into that. Play a little music while people do that, and we will shut down this recording, and so it won't be recorded into the actual recording. So if you want in on the chat, hop on the live party line.
Thank you.
Hi, Jane. We'll let people call in real quick. Take a second to. We're on a 30-second delay when we do the live streaming, so the number I think is just showing up to everyone. Called some of that. I guess in the meantime, if folks want to kind of check in who's here, just so we know, this is Will Sullivan from HNF.